Welcome to Psych 319, Chapter 1, Part 3. I'm going to continue and talk about how cognitive psychology developed in the more recent past. So it was very much inspired by two things, the development of the computer and human factors engineering, and I'll get into both of those in a second. Um, so a bunch of people, most notably Noam Chomsky, uh, started to, as a computer was starting to become more common apparatus. I mean, not that it was in households yet in the 50s and 60s, prominently in the 60s. Um, we started to think about how information was processed, and the more we learned about computers, the more we started to think about the mind in terms of a computing device. Human factors engineering was another influence on cognitive psychology, where we started to realize that we needed to design machines better um, so that humans could use them better. And there was a famous case of an airline test pilot who ran a brand new plane into the ground because they designed it improperly, and they put essentially the gas right next to the brakes, and it was poor design that led to his death. So cognitive psychology rejects strict behaviorism. Cognitive psychologists insist that there are some mental representations and things going on inside our head, and so even though we might not be able to directly measure it, um, we might be able to indirectly measure these things. There was influence of the hard sciences, physics and biology, and so on and so forth, and artificial intelligence and computing all started to mix together to form this discipline of cognitive psychology. Um, and then another idea was the idea of modularity, that specific parts of your brain would be dedicated to different functions so that you can compute an overall task faster. So some parts of your brain would be dedicated to color, and some to hearing, and some to speaking, and they all operate in parallel so that you can move through the world very quickly. And then there was the discovery of generative grammar. Chomsky discovered that it appeared we had what's called a language acquisition device, that kids kind of automatically learn language. I mean, we think that we teach children language, but if you just drop a child in the middle of an environment, if they're young enough, they will pick up the language on their own, which shows us that we have some innate cognitive processing abilities, that we don't have to be taught everything. Right, okay, I mentioned that stuff. So other influences, I'm just going to cruise over these really, really quickly because they're in your book. Empiricism, the idea that you can observe things, and empiricism emphasizes the role of the environment in science. Nativism emphasizes the role of native ability, and these sort of form the early seeds of the nature-nurture debate, where empiricism sort of sides with nurture, and nativism sort of sides with nature. And then there was a class of psychologists called the Gestalt psychologists, and this was very early on. They're famous for the saying, the whole is greater than the sum of their parts. Let me give you an example of that. So here you have an illusion. Most of you probably perceive this as a red disc that probably sits somewhere behind a white piece of paper with little slits cut into it. And that's your brain making an interpretation of the physical sensations that exist on the computer screen. If I were to just rotate that middle disc just slightly, now you probably see a kind of like a peppermint candy or a round figure sitting on top of a series of black intersecting lines. Now I'll go back to the original. They're exactly the same. The only thing that's different is they're slightly askew. The lines are now slightly askew over here, but your perception is radically different, meaning that the whole of your perception is greater than the sum of just the parts that are on the screen. The way you interpret things is very, very important, and we'll see other examples of this. And then Piaget, the famous developmental psychologist, brought up the idea of a genetic epistemology, meaning that intellectual abilities depend upon whatever developmental stage a child is in. So A 4-year-old child cannot do calculus, and there's a reason for that. Their brain hasn't developed to that stage yet. They're not capable of abstract thought, only in rare circumstances. And the physiology has to develop before the mental ability develops. So if you're going to use a computer metaphor, you'd say the hardware has to be there before the software develops. And then we got to the idea of, from Galton, studying individual differences, comparing people, looking at how intelligence is genetically linked, and so on and so forth. All right, so this brings us kind of to more contemporary times. Current trends in cognitive science. Now, there's cognitive psychology, cognitive science, and cognitive neuroscience, and these are all really breeds of really similar birds of a feather. Um, Cognitive science is a blend of psychology, neuroscience, and computer science, traditionally. It tends to lean away from biology, but it certainly acknowledges it doesn't mean that they don't believe in biology. They just tend not to be concerned with it, like I mentioned at the beginning of the chapter. There are many research methods that we use to study human cognitive processes, just observing people in their natural behavior, naturalistic observation, so watching a person do a task. And this is good because it has really good validity, meaning that if you observe somebody doing something in the natural environment, then there's a good chance that your study is going to predict future behaviors in that environment as well. But it's very difficult to control things. So it's sometimes difficult to do a study in the middle of Manhattan because you can have taxi cab horns honking and people mucking up your experimental scene and so on and so forth. So there are hazards to naturalistic observation. There's a strong potential for bias. Sometimes when you're observing something, you see what you want to see as an experimenter. Sometimes it's not very objective. Introspection, I won't go over that because we've already talked about introspection. Controlled observation is sort of like you bring somebody into your lab to behave in a natural way. So a sleep study is a great example of that. We can't go over to somebody's house very easily and watch them sleep, but we can bring them into a sleep lab. So the behavior is largely natural, even though they are hooked up to a variety of hysterical devices to monitor physiological responses and brain activity and so on and so forth. But it's a little more controlled than going over to their house where who knows what may happen when you're trying to observe them sleeping. So we conduct experiments. And good experimentation involves manipulating one or a very few independent variables and measuring the effect of that manipulation on an output variable, a dependent variable. Change one thing and measure the effect of that change. That's the idea of experimentation. And you can do this by comparing two different groups. We call that a between subjects design, so like comparing men versus women on something, or within subjects of designs. Let's say you want to look at one person and follow them over time. And you can do that for a bunch of people, like looking at all first graders and watch their progress from first to second grade. And you can study that by individual by individual. And then case studies, you can do a study on a single specific individual. There's a famous patient, HM, that's sort of his initials, who was probably the most important patient in psychology, but definitely the most important in memory because he had very unique memory loss, very unique patterns of memory loss because of a surgery that he had on his brain. So we'll get into that when we get into memory. I don't want to get too sidetracked. Anyway, so you can study from one individual person, and I won't get into quasi-experiments, but it's mentioned in the book, I believe. Ultimately, the goal is to find physiological, anatomical correlates of behavior. That's the long-term goal, to shape people's lives and cure disease and help people function better. But again, that's not the domain of cognitive psychology, but rather cognitive neuroscience. And cognitive neuroscience will include techniques like positron emission tomography, MEG, MRI, and so on and so forth. And these are different ways of measuring the brain, standard brain scanner. That gives you some pretty pictures, and parts of the brain light up when somebody's doing a particular task, and you relate those areas and those physiological processes to their behavior and hopefully understand the behavior better. So some paradigms in cognitive psychology is the information processing approach, which is what we've been talking about all along, where you study the flow of information processing. And then there is the connectionist approach, where the idea is that knowledge is represented in a neural network. So information processing, if you were to take its strictest definition, is it means that information is processed serially. That's bits of information are processed one at a time. The connectionist approach says that things operate in parallel, so you can be working on two tasks at the same time. Ignore this stuff right here. It's not going to be relevant. So this is just a very brief memory task where somebody's asked to memorize a number of things from a list, and then you probe them and ask them, well, was that number in the list that you had to memorize? And so you look at all that, you present them with a probe. Presumably there's a bunch of decisions that happen along that stage serially, and there's a resulting output. So you increase the number of symbols in memory, and you'll find that the reaction time increases. And that's a way of measuring cognitive processes using reaction times and by manipulating the variable. This is a classic experiment. A connectionist approach, which really comes from the study of artificial intelligence, sort of the way an artificial intelligence model would go is you would have a number, these are all, this schematic represents layers in a computer, computational layers, and you would create computational neurons, or rather a program, a small program that represents a neuron and what that neuron does. Let's say it's a neuron responsible for vision, and you get a bunch of those and you put them together. And we know how visual neurons pretty much operate, so you can characterize their behavior and put that in the input layer. And then let's say you have another neuron that you know the behavior of pretty well, like a motor neuron, and you sum up a bunch of motor neuron programs, and you make that your output layer. And then you have what's called a hidden layer. These are a bunch of neurons that you don't program, you just leave them kind of blank. And you connect everything together in this model, and then you show, at the input stage, you show this computer brain a bunch of pictures. You essentially train it up on something. You give it a task, you train it up on the task, and you measure what happens to the output behavior and what happens to the hidden layer when you're training it. And I know this is a very rough sketch, but the idea is that a lot of things are highly connected, and a lot of processes are happening in parallel. And by studying them in the computer model, we might learn something about the brain. It turns out that this kind of model is more close to the way the brain processes information. We tend to divide bits of information up, and we tend to process multiple things at the same time. We don't always do this straight linear model that I showed you before. It's more chaotic than that. We'll get into this in a second. I'm going to roughly skip over these. You can check these out in your slide notes. Those are pretty straightforward. Maybe since that is the last slide, maybe I'll cheat to it if I don't run out of time. Okay, so the evolutionary approach, we talked about that certain neural systems evolved under certain specific ecological pressures, but there's the notion that the brain might be a bag of tricks, that you might have several modular processes that are dedicated to different tasks, and they all work together to help you function through the world, but certain brain areas developed for certain tricks and might not be used for other things. So we don't tend to use the whole brain all the time for the same thing. Obviously, as an extreme example is your language area becomes very, very active when you're processing language. And that would be an example of modularity. And one last influence here is the ecological approach, the idea that abilities are shaped by culture and our environment as well. So abilities may vary in artificial settings. You could take, I'm trying to think of an example, like, I have to round this up really quickly, but for example, language varies across cultures, and different cultural traditions vary depending on where you are, and different ways of thinking develop depending on where you live. Okay, that wraps up Chapter 1. Hope you enjoyed it.